Welcome to KIMEcast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work. Welcome to KIMEcast. Tony Mikla.
Evan Hogger.
All right, so we're going to talk tonight a little about the joint-by-joint approach, and this is deep for me because this really, I feel like this changed my practice at the end of the day, and it's a simple concept, a simple article is written by Mike Boyle and with partnership with Greg Cook in the process, and two of my mentors and guys I've learned so much from over the years. But when I heard this, I was like, man, this is really a clean and simple way to look at the body and look at movement, and then take this concept of kinetic linking of how energy travels through the body and do it in an efficient manner. So excited to dive into this with you guys tonight and talk about how to look for it, how it works, how it flows, and some of the significant aspects of it. So, but let's have a beer first, Evan. What are we drinking here?
All right. We are going with Happy Hops. This is an IPA from Russian River Brewing Company. I've never had this one, so we're in for a surprise.
Well, Happy Hops, you can't really go wrong.
I guess not.
What's most important is that we open this beer with a rock blade, and I think that's important to mention.
It's not even like a neat trick. There's actually a bottle opener.
Actually, a bottle opener on the blade tool. I can't remember the exact what they call that. This is the older version of it, but it's really super cool. It's a bottle opener, so it's nice for situations like this, which you don't get often.
In a rehab
environment.
I failed opening it with my wedding ring, so we had this as backup. Don't tell my wife.
It was good.
She doesn't watch these anyway. That's good.
Well, it's the fact that you tried is what's most important there, as always. So. All right, so this joint-by-joint approach. So this was written in such a way where it's really, really simple. The concept is that you have these stacked joints on the body, and as you look at the bottom of the body, like the foot moving on up the whole chain, you have this alternating sequence of joints that require more mobility and then joints that require more stability. And it's alternating, so you have mobility, stability as you go up the chain. And if that pattern is demonstrated in the body, you're able to get good force transfer and good energy transfer through the system. So it works really well. So let's go through a couple examples. So let's say we take the ankle as a good place to start. So if you look at the ankle joint, this is the joint that does what we call dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. It allows you to kind of move forward in your gait cycle or kind of do like a calf stretch, essentially, would be a dorsiflexion movement. And a plantar flexion movement would be like a heel raise to go up on your toes. So usually it does that quite well, but we find out that as we age, we notice that with aging, we definitely have a difficult time acquiring more and more dorsiflexion. It's one of those things that becomes more stiff. We also see this with athletes. So when we're training an athlete, whether it be a speed and performance athlete or a fitness athlete, we'll find that dorsiflexion becomes something that gets tight on them. They'll start to lose dorsiflexion with more and more impact and more training. Dorsiflexion becomes more limited, and that becomes a problem because it starts to affect the sequence. The ankle needs to be able to flex forward quite a bit, and when you start to lose that, then you start to put force on the joints above and below. So eventually you transfer force down to the foot, and then you transfer force up into the knee.
And that becomes relevant when you start talking about what those other joints do. So I usually start this at the ground and work the way up. So if we go down below now the ankle, the dorsiflexion, the talocrural joint, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, we look at the subtalar joints, so responsible for supination and pronation. If we just think about most of the people we've seen with an issue at that part of the body, there will be people that have mobility issues. Maybe they've been in a boot for 6 weeks. But most of the time, the majority of the time, we can say that there's probably a control or a stability issue down there, right? Like, what do we say most people? It's overpronation is a problem.
Absolutely.
It's a big plaguing problem. And not that pronation is bad. We need pronation for normal movement, but too much of it and uncontrolled pronation can be a problem. So most of our interventions then are geared towards helping somebody create a little more stability in that part of the foot. Whereas in the ankle, at the talocrural joint, most of our interventions are geared toward creating a little bit more mobility.
Yeah.
Right? And then if we go up above the ankle joint now, we talk about the knee.
And we look at the knee joint. So the knee itself, you've got this big long tibia, so you got this big long bone below it, and then you got your femur or the big long bone above it. Two longest bones in the body, up and down above and below the knee. And if you look at injuries that you see to the knee, we see these injuries of ACL tear, PCL tear, MCL tear, LCL tear, meniscus tear, or maybe some osteochondral deficits or a bone bruise. All of those are due to too much motion. When you move your knee too far, you tear ligaments.
I think even more simply, that's absolutely true. Even more simply, though you said those two long bones, those are two longest bones in our body. So two long levers, and what does that mean in physics? Longer levers equals higher forces at intersection, so there's a problem. The other piece of this is that the knee is a hinge joint that we can argue screw home and all that, but arguably moves in one plane, and your body in the world happens in three planes. So we're asking for a problem. All those injuries are injuries of stability. When foot's planted on the ground, no longer is the knee in control of rotation and motion and movements in the frontal plane, but we're talking about the foot, which we just said before, responsible for supination and pronation, and something even higher up, the hip, also being responsible for that.
Yeah. So you got the knee where this, basically you've just got this flat tibial surface, and you've got this femur that comes down, sits on top of it, and then all these ligaments to hold it together. And we see obviously that a lot of problems there. I've never had a client come to me in my history of 20 years now in professional performance enhancement and physical therapy where someone said, hey, my ACL is too strong. It's too tight. Could you stretch it out for me, please? Right? It's always been, they've torn it, they've damaged it, but it's never been too tight. Yeah. So that's a sentiment to say that this is an area that's usually too loose. Now, controversially, if you go up to the next joint from the knee up, you got the hip joint. The hip's got this really deep socket. So you have a really, really deep, what's called acetabulum, which is the socket of the hip. And you've got this big femoral head. So at the top of your femur, at the top of your hip bone, you've got this nice big round ball, and that socket and ball fit really round together. And when they fit well together, they don't come apart. It doesn't dislocate very often. It doesn't sublux. It doesn't move very much. It's very, very congruent, which leads to it being a little bit more stiff. You guys that sit on a regular basis, you feel this. So when you've been sitting all day at work or you're sitting at the computer, your hips feel stiff. You want to stretch out your hip flexor, stretch out your hamstrings, loosen this joint back up.
So I agree, but I would also say, and when I usually talk about this, I usually say that the rule that we're saying of alternating requirements of stability and mobility are kind of broken at the hip here, though, too. So there is a stability component, and I think stiffness is number one, and that's the first place you go and look. But the hip plays a big role, like I was saying, in controlling the femur in three planes, so internal and external rotation of the lower extremity. And so that knee that only moves in one plane is very much controlled, especially when the foot's planted in the ground, it's very much controlled by the hip. So there's absolutely a stability component here too that has to be considered.
Yeah, no, that's the center of the body. I mean, at the end of the day, everything surrounds around that hip. So this is obviously a balance. It's not to say that there's one way or the other, but that you find tendencies. And if people that are inactive, the tendency of the hip is that it gets stiff. The people that are hyperactive, tendency of the hip is that it can get stiff. And in the process of it getting stiff, we lose this ability to control the femur, and then that leads to problems in the knee, leads to problems in the ankle, and on down the chain. So it's putting things together in the big picture that really make this sequence important. And that's what we want to think about is this alternating sequence. So you got the foot's hypermobile, ankle's stiff, knee's hypermobile, hip gets a little bit stiff. Next joint up would be your lumbar spine. So this low back, right? So we have this ridiculous low back scenario where 83% of the American population suffers from low back pain that causes some level of disability. So this is the biggest injury we have in the country is low back pain, and it causes significant levels of dysfunction. And how is it set up? Well, you've got these 5 different layers of vertebrae, so 5 bones of the spine. They're stacked on top of each other, and the only thing that supports them is a bunch of soft tissue. So there's some muscles. You've got the discs that sit inside there. You got the ligaments around it, but that's it. All of the weight of your head, of your arms, of your trunk lays on this structure, and you've got to be able to rotate side to side, be able to bend forward, extend back, bend side to side. All kinds of motion happens in the lumbar spine, and because of all that motion, people complain they get a lot of pain. It's obviously a big problem of a pathology.
And so you could even like zoom out a little bit, like 50,000 foot view, and just look globally at the skeleton, right? So you've got this, like, what if an engineer was looking at it? This is what they might think, right? So you've got this low back that's, you said all these vertebrae stacked there. Then you've got this big pelvis with 2 support beams sticking down. And then you go above it and you've got this big sturdy looking thoracic cage above it, thoracic rib cage above it. You've got this little thing. So if like a force is coming at this structure that's built here, this, skeleton structure, where like an engineer is going to point to the weak point being right there.
Definitely
right?
The weakest link.
And you look at all of the injuries that we see in the low back, it all comes back to a stability thing. And then if you just take this a step further and you look at the most basic, most minimal thing, most people in the world, when their back hurts, what is the first thing they say to you? Like, I know my core needs to be stronger. I need better stability. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep, 100%. Yeah, yes, you do. And so we've been preaching this as, physical therapy has been preaching this forever as core stability. Everybody talks about this. Fitness, population talks about this. Chiro talks about this. Core stability is obviously the biggest thing. And then you can talk about what that means and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, stabilizing this midsection is obviously really, really important. And giving the lumbar spine more support is really what we're looking for. Then above that, you have this thoracic rib cage, thoracic spine. So now you have all these ribs around your body. And these ribs give a tremendous amount of stiffness or support to the structure. So I've never met someone with a thoracic spine that's hypermobile. It doesn't move too much. It's always on the side of too stiff. And so here we go again with a structure that needs to move a little bit. And it needs to move for a lot of reasons. So it's designed to move better in rotation than the lumbar spine. It should allow for a lot of rotation. It needs to allow for extension. And the more this thoracic spine moves, the more pressure it takes off the low back. But most importantly, I think, and what we see clinically, is probably the biggest impact it has is if the thoracic spine is stuck in a certain way, and if you're using, your phone on a regular basis, which we know we all are, or if you're using the computer on a regular basis, you're a bit flexed forward, and then thoracic spine stuck forward. And then you come in and you say, I want to be able to do an overhead press or reach my arm over my head. Well, that shoulder can't do that if your thoracic spine is stuck in a forward position. And it's stuck in this, we call flexed position. Mm-hmm. So we need to get that rib cage to move enough that the shoulder blade can move around it and allow for the shoulder to reach overhead. So this combination of the thoracic spine tends to get stiff is really highly correlated with both shoulder and low back pain. So.
And even the cervical spine, right? Like this is really, the thoracic spine is really like the money maker for clinicians and coaches out there, right? It's like, it's kind of the linchpin between all of these three very, very, very commonly injured or things with issues, right? So the shoulder, hypermobile joint, the neck, a hypermobile joint, low back, hypermobile joint, and this thoracic spine is the one thing that kind of has in common with all of those things. And when this is stiff, you're going to start to get stresses put on the body in other places. And that's really the key behind this joint by joint approach, is to say that the areas that tend to get stiff, when they do get stiff, when normal motion doesn't happen there, we get excessive stress put on the structures around it, and that's where we start to see these repetitive injuries, like long-term, not like a single event, but long-term, like degenerative cuff tears, or these like discs that blow in the back or in the cervical spine, or these neuropathies that we see in those cases too. All of that stuff really probably somewhat comes back to that thoracic spine, and it's such a good moneymaker for us to say, like, let's address this first.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a key to dysfunction that we see, like you said, across all those segments. So it's really important you take a look at it. And frankly, in the clinical world, it's not addressed that often. People are really focused on what hurts the most. Well, usually what hurts, okay? So what fills up the practices of orthopedics around the world is shoulder pain, low back pain, and knee pain. Those are your top three orthopedic injuries. Well, those are all three hypermobile segments. The things that move more tend to complain more, right?
And if you could add two, like after that, it's probably the neck, and it's probably plantar fasciitis in the bottom of the foot.
Yep.
So we've just kind of...
Yep. All the joints that move a lot tend to complain a lot. And the joints that get stiff, they just sit back in the corner and they're like, I'm just stiff, don't worry about me. But they're causing all of these other problems. So it's so important as a clinician that we look at, what are the stiff joints doing? Make sure the stiff joints are moving adequately so that the joints that do a lot of movement are supported well and have a good support system. So to summarize, when we look back at this, we could say that there's really three main joints we've discussed that are stiff. So the ankle tends to get stiff, the hip tends to get stiff, and then the thoracic spine tends to get stiff. And if we're looking at those areas, we have specific tests that we do to say that. So if you're coming in for a visit with us, we're going to evaluate your ankle, we're going to evaluate your hip, we're going to evaluate your thoracic spine, make sure that they move adequately. Because if they don't, there's no way that you can transfer energy through the body in an effective way. It's simply not possible. So it's paramount to how well you move as a person that those three things can contribute.
So I think it's huge when it comes to pain, right? So we've talked about that. Those joints are going to complain a little bit more. But I also think this is imperative when it comes to performance. So you just kind of started to mention kinetic linking there. We see this so many times with our baseball guys. It's such a rotational sport that requires so much range of motion in different places. guys come in and see us maybe not always because of pain, but maybe because velocity is down or exit velocity when they're hitting is down or something's not quite right. And so to evaluate the kinetic chain is really to evaluate the joint by joint system, and very, very many times out of 10, a thoracic spine rotation issue or a hip rotation issue is the thing that we kind of come back to in those guys that are trying to create rotational power.
Yep. See it so often in every sport, whether it be golf, especially the rotation sports, golf or throwing or hitting or tennis, something like that. So we for sure see it.
But even simple stuff like just squatting up and down, I think a super easy to conceptualize version of this is when we talk about dorsiflexion. So if you go to squat down, you're missing a little bit of dorsiflexion. So when you go to squat down, you need your tibia to translate over your foot. If you run out of dorsiflexion, your tibia you're still gonna try to squat down, so your tibia has to go somewhere. So it's either gonna go in or out. Probably more commonly going to go in. What happens when it goes in? Well, a whole bunch of stuff. Your foot collapses. That could lead to an arch issue in your foot or some pain down there. Yeah. Your knee is also getting a valgus stress on it. So again, kind of like you said before, the pain might be in the bottom of the foot, the pain might be in the knee, but the real culprit here is the ankle, and it takes you kind of like zooming out a little bit and looking away from that hot area, that inflamed area, to figure out what the real issue is to prevent that from happening again.
Yeah. The reason I was so excited when I first read this is just a light bulb popped up for me where I was like, man, this makes sense. As a student, you're taught to look at a joint above and below the segment that you're looking at. So if someone says, hey, my knee hurts, you're taught to look at the hip, taught to look at the ankle, but you're never
really told what to do.
You're not told what to do, right? So you're like, hey, look at this,
Looks
but
cool.
but look for what?
Yeah.
Like, what exactly is important here? You know, like what should I do with it now that I see it? So when you start to see this as a sequence, as a series, and you see this above and below, what am I looking for? You try to look at these different joints, it really starts to come to life. And you're like, I can see that these big three segments of stiffness are really, really important to focus on. So ankle, hips, and thoracic spine. Now the other areas would be the foot, as Evan talked about, like the pronation, supination, and the foot. So the foot's got 26 bones and joints that correlate with those. So there's tons of ability for movement there. So it tends to be hypermobile. Right, then you've got the knees hypermobile, low back's hypermobile, shoulders hypermobile, cervical spine's hypermobile. So one thing to challenge this philosophy, let's say, you know what, I'm not sure, that seems too simple, that's too bland. How can I challenge this philosophy? Well, let's let the free market, do this for us. Let the free market challenge the philosophy. So this is what I would say. So I'd suggest you go to Dick's Sporting Goods or Big Five or wherever you shop for sporting goods apparel, and go to the bracing section, go to the bracing aisle that they have, and see what's available. You know, see how many hip braces you find at Big Five. I'd love to see. If you take the hip braces and you compare them to how many hip braces you have versus how many knee braces are available, I think there's going to be a striking difference. Mm-hmm. Knee braces you could probably buy in a pink color, and you could probably buy in a black. And you could probably buy every color you could think of in between. And you could buy some that are just stabilizers. You could buy some that have metal guards on the side. You know, you can order some really hefty ones with big metal stays on them, right?
There's multi-million-dollar companies that are built around just doing that.
Just knee braces, right?
Don Joy.
Yeah. And why just knee braces? Because the knee's hypermobile. Because you tear your ACL, your PCL, your MCL, your LCL, your meniscus, because you tear these things. And so if your muscles can't stabilize them, then we better put a brace on you. It's pretty straightforward. Now, then you got to look at what's the number one brace in the world, right? Number one brace in the world would be an orthotic, okay? So an orthotic, they sell them everywhere. You could buy it at the grocery store. You can buy orthotics at the grocery store, Dr. Scholl's.
Right by the checkout counter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can walk in by CVS, you get some, hey, I want to get some gummy bears, and oh yeah, I'll take an orthotic. Thank you. Everybody needs one, right? So you throw it in to support your arch and to support that foot, because everybody's got a hypermobile foot. Not everybody, but the vast majority, it's a common problem.
Those companies are betting on percentages, right? They're saying, here's the problem, here's gonna be the problem, here's a solution.
Yeah. So I've got foot orthotics coming out the wazoo. I've got knee braces like crazy. How about the low back? You know, you could buy a low back brace at Home Depot. Every employee is wearing one, right? It's required because when they're lifting stuff, they're going to blow their back out. So you can buy low back braces everywhere, and every variety. You can have a little cummerbund. You can have this big excessive stabilizer.
The suspenders.
Suspenders. You get the whole thing. You know, multiple Velcro straps.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence that Home Depot did that. That's a risk mitigation issue for them. They had enough workers' comp claims because of low back issues from picking up 2x4s or gardening stuff or whatever it is. They're like, well, let's just put a brace on everybody.
Yeah. And then, but you notice that nobody's wearing a thoracic spine brace. You don't see those for sale very often. You can't even buy one because they don't exist, right?
Yeah.
You'd have to have a really bad car accident to have blown out your thoracic spine and break a vertebrae. Then they put you in a TLSO, and that's a bad situation. But it's got to be prescription.
Right.
You can't buy that over the counter, right?
So then what's the one other brace? There's one other joint, one other structure. You just said car accident.
Yeah, so you got the neck, of course,
Yeah,
the whiplash.
the cervical collar fits.
You can get the cervical collar. You get that at CVS as well.
Exactly.
It's over the counter, no problem, because it's hypermobile. The neck tends to move a lot, so you put a little whiplash, little collar on you, no problem. Now, the one area that's hypermobile would be the shoulder that doesn't have a good bracing solution because there's no good brace. It's so mobile, you can't stabilize it,
Most
right?
mobile joint in the body because
Yeah.
it has to be.
Has to be also to the body. You got this little tiny socket, huge ball, moves like crazy, every dimension you could think of, most free joint in the body. They make a Sully brace, which is a great stabilizer, but then you can't raise your arm, but at least it's stable, but that's the best we've got at the moment.
Yeah, you watch basketball players, football players, that thing on, and that arm is practically useless for them at that point.
90 degrees is a plus.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of hypermobile shoulders, I think we're both good examples of that.
Yeah.
Both multiple time dislocators.
We
so
do have that in common. I have not dislocated, I've just subluxed
whatever.
20-something times. Does that count?
I think that counts.
Let's get clear.
Okay.
But anyway, I agree. So yeah, this is what happens to the shoulder. It dislocates, it subluxes. It moves a lot, right? You don't come in with, people have a frozen shoulder, but that's usually a response of our hyperactive nervous system to really guard and protect that joint and say, hey, it's unsafe. It's going to dislocate. I'm going to lock down and really freeze up around it and give you that stability. So that's an interesting condition. That's a unique situation, but probably more neuro-related than it is capsular, as has been so alluded to. So I think when you look at this process, I think it's a really, really good structure to look at as far as how do you look at the body, this joint-by-joint approach. Like I said, it simplified my practice tremendously as to what's most important, what's going to make a difference in this patient's life, what's going to help them go from A to B,
Yeah.
Y to Z, what's going to make them take this next step. And so there's big rocks here, and can you move the big rocks? Can you get ankle dorsiflexion? Can you get hip internal rotation? Can you get hip flexion? Can you get hip extension? And can you get thoracic rotation and thoracic extension? If you can do those simple things, you're going to move fairly well. If you can do those simple things, I would be willing to bet 99% of the time the person's going to have a weakness problem. They're going to have a stability or motor control problem. That's what you're going to want to address.
Right, and so really what this does then is kind of guide your assessment and then your interventions. When somebody's standing in front of you with a medial knee pain or whatever this is, and you've got all of these things, you got to look locally or look at all this stuff really helps like target and direct how you think. So for me, I didn't come across this later in my career. I was fortunate enough to be around people like yourself and other mentors that kind of guided me towards this information, so it was something that came to me more early on, but I don't really know how I would have done my job without it, to be honest. I think there's so many things to make your head spin, right? But this really does help direct your assessment process. I even think as a coach, it helps you direct your assessment process, and then the interventions that you choose to do. So I think it's imperative.
Yeah. So you guys can check it out. There's tons of articles written about this, about joint-by-joint approach, and you guys search Mike Boyle, Boyle. Mike's a phenomenal coach. He's just an influencer of the entire field, strength conditioning, strength conditioning coach of the Boston Bruins for years, and the Celtics and everybody in between. Lives out in Boston, of course. Has a great program out there. And then Greg Cook as well was kind of the influencer and the co-author of the article, but most if you search joint-by-joint approach Mike Boyle, you can get a good read for it. The only area that we separate a little bit between what the article you'll see that Mike wrote was regarding the shoulder, and he defines the scapular-thoracic joint as a joint in that. And I debate that, and we've talked with Mike and Greg about this, and it's not really a joint. A joint's an articular surface, and there's really the scapular-thoracic joint doesn't really exist. So in our world, we found that certainly the scapula has to move quite a bit, and the shoulder needs stability, is what we found. But in general, the shoulder is very, very hypermobile, as we all know. The number one problem with the shoulder is dislocation, subluxation, as we've both experienced personally, and it's certainly been it's the number one thing we see. No one's come to me outside of an adhesive capsulitis and say, hey, my shoulder's way too tight. Once you get somebody moving, you get them out of the pain zone, it becomes hypermobile. Just look at a person. Look at a little baby, and you see the hypermobility in a baby and a shoulder development. Then you look at somebody who's had a stroke at the age of 80 or 90, and guess what happens when you had a stroke and you can't control your arm? Guess what happens to the shoulder? It falls out of the socket. Now we got a dislocation problem just sitting in the wheelchair. So clearly the shoulder is very, very mobile, and when you take away the nervous system, whoop, that joint falls apart. So that's the only separation we have in our approach to it, but essentially we really feel that the shoulder is hypermobile and we want to stabilize that. And then we really focus on mobility of the ankles, the hips, and the thoracic spine is kind of your core. If you take it further, the elbow would be the next stiff segment, and we see that as well. Someone has an elbow fracture, an elbow issue, getting elbow range of motion back is very, very difficult. The elbow tends to get kind of stiff. And then the wrist, again, is hypermobile. 3 planes of motion, hypermobility, wrist fractures, cartilage problems, carpal tunnel syndromes. Wrist becomes hypermobile as well, and that's what
lots of bones and not a lot of structures to control it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, same story.
And a joint that's often used for weight bearing in ways that it may not necessarily be appropriate for.
Like a push-up situation or something. So this is a great tool. I hope this helps in the fact that maybe how you look at your own body and where you focus your efforts. I think a lot of people skip their thoracic spine, their area of their warm-up or their movement preparation work. And certainly as a clinician, if you're working with shoulder patients, you may not look at the thoracic spine so much. But for us, it's a paramount thing to look at and view because it really sets the stage for if it's not right, the shoulder can't be right.
And it's such an easy thing to address. When somebody comes into you in that inflammatory phase, you can't do a whole lot with their shoulder, but you can very easily get them to rotate a little bit. And like you said, you set the stage, lay the foundation so you can build that shoulder dynamic stability on top of that. Yeah, 100%.
Same thing with the low back and the knee problems. Look at that hip, make sure that hip is moving. I'd say 90% of our low back cases are focused on hip mobility. If we get the hip to move, the low back tends to decrease its spasms, tends to feel much, much better. But if the hip is stiff, that low back has to move more. If I'm going to pick something up off the ground, okay, say somebody drops some money on the ground, I got to pick it up. Even if my hip doesn't move whatsoever, I'm going to bend my back to go get it. I've got to, because I'm going to get that money, right? I'm going to go get it. So no matter what, you're going to sacrifice to get the movement done. And when you do that, you pay the price for it.
The other side of that is just take gait, for instance. If you don't have hip extension, right, you're still going to push the ground behind you. What's the next place you can extend your body with? You're going to extend through your lumbar spine. So, in both directions, without the hip, that's too easy to happen. Yeah.
So focus on the hip for mobility, and then again on the ankle. Ankle, same thing. We see so many knee issues that come about, and even plantar fascia issues or foot issues that come about due to a stiff ankle. So make sure you mobilize that ankle and get that thing moving the way that it should. But these are we found them to be really, really simple tools, but profound tools in the way that we work with people and help them get back to their process. So take a look, take an evaluation. We teach a class on this. We do our Bulletproof series on this, which is focused on evaluating these segments, setting up certain processes around these segments to assess them, and then intervene to get their movement back because it's so paramount. So if you need some help there, check that out, and we're happy to work with you. But thanks for watching KIMEcast. This was KIMEcast, and we are the KIME Human Performance Institute. Thank you very much for listening. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Please hop on our social media. It's at KIMEHPI and engage with us there. If you'd like us to feature a topic or answer any questions live on the show, post your comments there. You can also check us out on our website at KIMEperformance.com, and there you can see links to content that we've posted throughout our podcast for more information.